Well, my name is Colure Caulfield, and I am so excited to be presenting my thesis, Therapeutic Yoga and Ayurveda, an individualized biopsychosocial spiritual approach to the treatment and management of inflammatory bowel disease. This thesis has essentially been in development ever since I first started this program nearly 3 years ago, when shortly thereafter I was actually diagnosed with IBD. And I have since, over the last 3 years, experienced many of the symptoms and struggles and experiences that you're going to hear about today. Essentially, my time in this program has been hallmarked by my experiences with this disease and also through my healing journey in relation to it. My purpose today is twofold. First, I'd like to establish and elucidate IBD as a complex biopsychosocial spiritually mediated disease. Second, to position yoga and Ayurveda as evidence-based, biopsychosocial, spiritually informed frameworks that offer specific tools and practices that are relevant to IBD treatment and management that go above and beyond what's currently available to most IBD patients today. IBD, or inflammatory bowel disease, is an autoimmune disease of the GI tract. It has two primary subtypes: Crohn's disease, which essentially can impact anywhere along the GI tract from the mouth all the way down, and ulcerative colitis, which is generally constrained to the colon. IBD is a particularly challenging disease to diagnose and treat because its exact underlying causes are not fully understood even today. However, current scientific consensus posits that IBD arises from a dynamic interplay between wide-ranging biological, psychological, sociological, and even environmental factors, including things like our genetics, our microbiome, stress and anxiety and trauma history, as well as developmental and environmental factors inclusive of our family dynamics and our diet. IBD is a debilitating and disruptive disease that is so very oftentimes invisible to the naked eye. However, it has GI symptoms that run the gamut, from abdominal pain and diarrhea and constipation to rectal bleeding and malnutrition, as well as extraintestinal symptoms that can affect essentially any other system in the body. IBD also causes structural complications, including strictures and obstructions, and can lead to long-term complications, including electrolyte imbalances and even cancer. Many IBD patients have to wait for years to finally obtain a proper diagnosis. And during that time, misdiagnosis is extremely common. No gold standard diagnostic array exists, and there is no cure. As such, and unsurprisingly, IBD takes a significant toll on the overall health and well-being of those who live with it day to day. And its impacts are felt across every single domain of life, from the biological, regarding the physical symptoms, side effects to medications and surgeries, to the psychological, inclusive of anxiety and the fear and the stress that comes from living with a chronic incurable disease, to the sociological effects, inclusive of work and school and family life, and even the spiritual effects, such as loss of control and a loss of purpose in life. Unfortunately, existing IBD treatment paradigms stem from a reductive biomedical model of disease that sole focus is on the physical pathology only, and the treatments are generally pharmaceutical in nature or surgical in nature. And even then, the available treatments are not always effective and carry their own risks and complications. As such, there is a desperate need for more individualized and biopsychosocial spiritually informed targeted treatments for IBD patients that address the full realm of their experience. So this biopsychosocial model was first introduced in the 1970s by George Engel. He sought to challenge the existing biomedical paradigm of the time, positing that the majority of chronic diseases arise from this dynamic interplay between biological, psychological, and social factors that then interact with our existing genetics and lifestyle and developmental conditions to ultimately inform our disease risk as well as its onset and its progression. This model was later expanded to include the spiritual domain of health, which is hallmarked by a felt sense of connection to life, as well as a connection to our purpose, and even a greater force at work in the universe. This expanded BPSS model takes a eudaimonistic view of health, which essentially posits that being connected to our purpose and to life's meaning is an absolutely vital component of our health and well-being. As I mentioned, IBD is beginning to be understood as this sort of biopsychosocial spiritually mediated disease. And there are numerous underlying physiological mechanisms at play that contribute to this dynamic nature. You may have heard about quite a few of them from many of our presenters today. Recently, scientists have determined that we have what's called a gut-brain axis, which is sometimes called our second brain. And this enteric nervous system functions much like our central nervous system in our brain in regulating important processes within our body. Essentially, it forms this bidirectional connection between our gut and our brain that is easily influenced by external factors. Earlier at the beginning of our program, you heard Ayana speak a bit about this HPA axis. It's an integral part of our gut-brain axis and a major player in our overall stress response. As she mentioned earlier, this hypothalamic, that is quite the mouthful, pituitary adrenal axis, or HPA axis, functions sort of like an information superhighway in between our brain and our gut that both sends and receives information, especially information related to feelings of threat and safety. And when it's activated by our stress response, a whole wide range of deleterious effects occur, especially with regard to our GI function. Essentially, our GI gets shut down. And so due to this inherent bidirectional relationship between our body's structure and function, psychosocial factors play a very significant role in IBD's pathogenesis. As such, IBD patients are not only more susceptible to psychiatric comorbidities such as anxiety and depression, however, our stress and our mental health itself plays a significant role in IBD's actual onset and progression. So we can think about this relationship again like bidirectionally, wherein IBD can create changes to our gut in its structure and its function that in turn affects changes to our nervous system and our brain. But likewise, psychological factors can also create changes to our gut that then exacerbate IBD. And so a lot of information. I was speaking kind of quick. So let's all pause for a moment. And if you want to close your eyes, you can, or leave them open. And just take a moment to notice the sensations in the body, perhaps especially around your belly or your neck or your torso. And now let's all take a deep breath in and a deeper breath out. And if you need another one or two, feel free. And as you're breathing, again, just noticing those physical sensations of the body, especially in those areas, noticing any changes. And so, much like we just did with our deep breath, yoga therapy is an intervention that empowers individuals to access greater health and well-being through the teachings and practices of yoga with relevance to IBD. Empirical research has shown time and again that yoga and its therapeutic application affords significant benefits across the wide BPSS spectrum. Biologically, it's been shown to improve our sleep, our energy, and alleviate pain. Psychologically, we know that it improves our mood, alleviates depression and anxiety. Sociologically, it connects us to community and improves our quality of life. And spiritually, it has the power to bolster our sense of empowerment, control, and hope. One of the key distinguishing factors of yoga therapy, separating it from standard allopathic approaches to treatment, is that it takes a salutogenic, as you've heard, or health-promoting approach to health and well-being, rather than focusing on pathology alone. Also, yoga therapists work collaboratively with their patients to develop individualized treatment plans, and they also empower their patients to become active participants in their own healing process. Of specific relevance to IBD treatment and management, yoga therapy has actually been shown to afford a wide array of impressive benefits on inflammatory and psychosomatic processes. Yoga therapy has shown to downregulate that HPA axis activation and to even shift the body into what's known as PNS, or parasympathetic nervous system dominance. And that could potentially afford us a long-term protective mechanism against stress. Again, you've heard this term before, and that makes me so excited because we are sort of all working from the same context. But yoga therapy works from this inherently biopsychosocial, spiritually informed perspective. And one of these frameworks that serves as this explanatory model for the interconnectivity between our mind, our body, and our spirit are these Panchamaya koshas. These 5 sheaths describe these interconnected layers of our being, and we can think about the koshas as sort of like components of a nesting doll, whereas like each subtle layer resides within the one that preceded it. And as such, whatever happens in one layer inevitably impacts all of the other layers and vice versa. And so although this framework is thousands of years old, the various layers and components of the Panchamaya koshas align quite elegantly with the modern BPS model. The Annamaya kosha, it relates to like that biological layer. It's our physical sheath, and it comprises our anatomy and physiology. As such, many presenting physical symptoms tend to reside within this kosha. Our Pranamaya kosha is associated with that psychophysiological or biopsycho domain. It's our vital sheath and comprises our energetic state, our overall vitality. Psychosocial symptoms tend to arise within this particular layer. The Manomaya kosha is that psycho layer. It's our mental sheath, or comprises our psychological domain, and it comprises conscious thought and intellect. Psychosocial symptoms also tend to arise within this domain, as well as mental health challenges. Moving even more subtle, our Vijnanamaya kosha is that psychosocial component. Again, it's our wisdom sheath. And social, relational, and cognitive difficulties tend to arise within this layer.
Can you advance the slides?
Oh, yeah. I got so excited. Finally, our most subtle layer, the Anandamaya kosha, is associated with that socio-spiritual layer of our being. It's our bliss sheath. It comprises that spiritual domain of health that I spoke about earlier and speaks to our ability to connect to awe and wonder and purpose and meaning in life. As such, imbalances in this particular layer tend to involve crises of faith, lack of connection, and lack of purpose. So therapeutic yoga interventions naturally work within this integrative framework of the Panchamaya koshas and offers a wide array of evidence-based tools and practices to address these imbalances as they arise. Anything from asana to pranayama, meditation and spirituality, and specific to IBD, practices such as restorative and chair yoga and trauma-sensitive yoga. Diaphragmatic breath, as we've had the chance to practice so very often tonight, as well as meditation practices including mindfulness and loving kindness, and lifestyle interventions such as sadhana and dinacharya. Which brings us to Ayurveda, the sister science of yoga. Ayurveda, or the science of life, just like yoga therapy, takes a holistic and salutogenic approach to overall health and well-being. It offers prescriptive and preventative practices and tools to address disease and dysfunction across the wide-ranging biopsychosocial spiritual spectrum. From an Ayurvedic point of view, all disease is thought to arise from an imbalance of what's called ojas, or vital essence, which presents within our unique individual physical constitution, or prakriti. Our physical constitution is influenced by modifiable psychosocial factors. And in Ayurveda, it's believed that digestive disturbances in particular are psychosomatic in nature, arising from unprocessed grief, anxiety, or fear, and even unresolved emotions. Essentially, when our digestive fire, our Agni, becomes imbalanced, it disturbs our doshas, which are part of our physical constitution, and leads to psychophysiological imbalance and eventually disease. Ancient Ayurvedic texts even make reference to a number of different digestive conditions that are very, very similar to IBD in nature. And so much like yoga therapy, Ayurveda is likewise informed by this inherently BPSS perspective. And one of the Ayurvedic frameworks that informs this integrative perspective is the gunas. These gunas are said to comprise all aspects of existence, and they characterize and influence our present state of being. As such, imbalances in the gunas lead to imbalances in the doshas, which comprise our physical constitution, and thus disease and or dysfunction follows. And so we can think about these three gunas as existing along a sort of psychophysiological spectrum, where rajas exists at one end and tamas at the other, and then sattva resides in the center. As I mentioned, sattva is this sort of quality of centeredness and balance and equanimity, whereas rajas has these qualities that are like activating and mobilizing, and when in balance are super duper necessary for things like giving presentations, being creative, feeling motivated, and the ability to affect positive change. However, when imbalanced, rajas tends to present as anger or arrogance, anxiety. It's sort of like that fight or flight or sympathetic arousal that we might all be familiar with. And then finally, tamas is a quality of like inertia and mass. When it's in balance, it's sort of like stability and groundedness. But when it's out of balance, it can show up as like a dullness, a fatigue, or depression, dissociation. It's that freeze response of our nervous system. And so it happens that these three gunas actually align quite elegantly with modern polyvagal theory, which is a psychophysiological framework developed by Stephen Porges that describes the underlying neuroanatomical and neurophysiological connections between our body, our mind, and our experience of safety and connection. As I mentioned, sattva is this feeling of like safety and connection and social engagement. Balanced rajas is like that safe, alert, and relaxed mobilization. Rajas, when it's in balance, is that defensive fight or flight. And tamas is that frozen, collapsed dorsal vagal state. Ayurvedic interventions naturally work within this integrative framework that's informed by the unique state of our gunas and our doshas to address imbalance and disease. Importantly, Ayurveda emphasizes moderation in all things and operates under the guiding principle that like attracts like and opposites create balance. As such, Ayurvedic interventions, much like yoga therapy, are not one size fits all and take a nuanced and personalized approach to individual health and well-being. In the case of IBD, even Ayurvedic interventions such as diet and lifestyle or dinacharya are going to be individualized. Therefore, there's not this like one prescriptive approach. And as such, yoga therapists are going to be working one-on-one with their patient or with their client to find the right approach to treatment that addresses that person's unique biopsychosocial spiritual spectrum. Ultimately, as we've seen, IBD is this sort of highly complex biopsychosocial spiritually mediated disease that, due to its individualized nature, requires an integrative and holistic treatment approach that addresses the entirety of the patient's experience across this spectrum. Yoga therapy and Ayurveda offer evidence-based tools and practices that have been shown time and again to be safe and effective in not only addressing IBD's symptoms and comorbidities, but also helping patients to feel more seen, more supported, and empowered on their own healing journey. And I should mention that it's sort of ironic and fitting that the last time that I stood in this building was 3 years ago when I started this program and was actually first exhibiting the early signs and symptoms of my very first IBD flare. And shortly thereafter was diagnosed. And during my time in this program, I've been through the gamut. I've been put through the ringer. I've had the experiences as the patient, as the self-advocate in the medical system. And I've also had the ability to learn through my personal yoga practice, as well as my practice as a yoga therapist with my clients. Firsthand, what we've spoken about tonight is the power of these practices, yoga therapy and Ayurveda, in addressing every single layer of my being, and so that I can hopefully apply that out in the world, and hopefully maybe you can too. Thank you so very much for listening. It was wonderful to speak with you tonight, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.